Good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar in a four-part webinar series from Wine Australia. My name is Julian Marchant and I'm the ESG Program Manager here at Wine Australia. We have an exciting session today. We've got three speakers, two of which are coming to you from overseas. We have Linda Johansson, who's coming to us from Sweden, Stockholm in Sweden, who's joining us early in the morning, and Dr. Peter Stanbury from Sustainable Wine Roundtable joining us from the UK. And we also have Mardi Longbottom, who's joining us from Adelaide. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge that I myself, I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and the continuing connection that Indigenous people have to Australian seas, land and water. I'll share my slides for a minute so it can provide some context on today's webinar. So what we hope to discuss today is very much around sustainability leadership and what that means from a European Union and a United Kingdom and a global perspective. And Peter and Linda will certainly touch on some of the drivers of sustainability, some of the changes that have occurred within the past 12 to 18 months, as we've seen an explosion of sustainability topics. And then slowly there's been a refinement of those topics and what that means for Australian grape and wine producers. Linda will talk about some of the differences between perhaps what's happening here in Australia and what's happening in Europe. In our last ESG webinar, we had Shay Courtney, who's the Sustainability Manager for Coles Liquor, and he talked about what's happening for Coles and an Australian-centric focus. This gives us an opportunity to hear about what's happening in other countries. We'll talk a little bit about partnerships for greater impact, and certainly Peter's been involved actively in pulling many different actors in the wine supply chain together to achieve sustainability outcomes and some of the opportunities that exist for the Australian wine sector. So to kick us off today, we have Dr. Peter Stanbury on the line. And Peter, I'll hand it over to you so that you can present.
Cool, thanks, Julian. Right, now assuming I can get technology to work at this stage in the morning, get going on the slides. Well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for asking me along today. I mean, we always say at SWR that we know nothing, but we know guys like you that do. As Julian said, our role is to provide a kind of convening process to draw together lessons and expertise as to what goes on sustainability in wine. We're a membership organisation, of which Wines Australia is one. We cover the whole wine supply chain, all the way from growers at one end to retailers at the other. Linda, Systembolaget is another of our members, but also others in the middle. You can see Veralia there, the bottle makers. So what we're able to do is to learn from along the supply chain about how sustainability manifests in different topics and different areas, and to really try and find collective, joined up ways of addressing the challenges we face. I mean, the issue sometimes with sustainability is there's this sort of sense of it's the problem of person X or organization X, and that's never very helpful. Our role is to come up with joined up, evidence-based approaches to addressing the various sustainability challenges in wine. Now, what Julian's asked me to talk about today is kind of where sustainability is going, why it's there, why we need to worry about it, why it's something that ends up sitting on all of our tables. And I think it's interesting to see that it's not just one causal thing. It comes from a whole bunch of key drivers. I mean, this is in no particular order. I'm just sort of working around my little graphic here. In many jurisdictions, you're seeing regulation around issues that to do with sustainability increasing. I mean, the obvious one at the moment would be around packaging and bottle weight. In the UK last year, this year was introduced an extended producer responsibility requirement, which means that those making packaging are responsible for dealing with it at the end of life, and that's a direct charge on in the case of the UK retailers. And you're seeing similar regulations coming into place in other parts of the world as well. And in the UK, for example, glass is charged at £240 a tonne. So obviously that becomes quite significant. So as you see regulation like that building up, that will continue to, put pressure on retailers and therefore on the rest of the supply chain to make change. Consumers can be funny ones. We see quite often surveys that will say that consumers say they value sustainability in the choices they make, but that doesn't always get followed up in terms of practice. But the fact remains that this becomes an issue. These, labour rights, packaging, carbon emissions are all issues that consumers care about, and again, therefore, will continue to be something that will keep putting pressure on regulators and also on retailers as well. You're beginning to see also, Julian's title has ESG in it. You're beginning to get investors and insurers looking at these issues as well, and particularly in times when climate change involves different risks around, for example, flooding and also fire. Those organisations which manage these issues better will tend to be seen as those that have a lower risk to insurers and therefore be more attractive to investors. You're also seeing a lot of pressure building from the downstream, from business partners. We'll hear from Linda in a minute about the issues that are important to them and other retailers. And I think that also has an impact all the way along the supply chain. And also, of course, bear in mind there will always be NGOs and civil society that will be looking out for malpractices, for things going wrong. Certainly, you've seen around labour rights issues in Europe over the last couple of years. You've seen, coverage in the press. For example, there was a piece in the FT, interestingly, about some labour rights abuses in northern Italy. So all of these things together mean that there will continue to be pressure around, ESG sustainability issues. So why do growers on the ground, why do people further up the supply chain need to be concerned about these issues? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, there's the value chain impact, that if you look at a lot of the regulatory frameworks around mandatory reporting on some of these things, of course, only larger companies are required to comply with that. But obviously, that then means they need to look down their supply chain. So, for example, if you look at carbon emissions, it's not just that larger companies need to report on their scope 1 and their scope 2. They also need to report on their scope 3, which is basically the whole of their supply chain. So therefore, there's that knock-on effect along the supply chain about those regulatory requirements coming in for bigger companies. But there's also a lot to be said for seeing sustainability and ESG issues as being really a matter of commercial common sense. And you've got some of the drivers here. You're going to get continued market access questions from those in many retail markets who will continue to make requirements of those further down the supply chain. You're going to get increased legal compliance. I know there's been regulatory changes coming in Australia at the moment. So again, there is that sort of sanitary issue about making sure that you are complying with all the necessary legal things. But I think there is also a sort of business continuity piece. Certainly a lot of what we're seeing at the moment in relation to viticultural practices, management of pruning, management of water, managing of power, a lot of that's got to do with just business continuity. I was talking to a vineyard in South Africa earlier in the week, and they're looking at how they can make sure that they've got enough water that they preserve within their site. They don't have to rely on external sources of water, which, given, as is the case in much of the Australian wine growing area, given increasing aridity, that provides them with a degree of security about their business. So one also needs to see these issues not just as a question of problem avoidance, but also a question of positive investment in business. And that's it, really. Risk management. Get on top of challenges before they get on top of you. And I think there is also always, when it comes to these issues, the issue of sort of social license to operate. There will always be those in the media and NGOs who will be looking for challenges, and we can avoid those before they become a challenge. So where are the main pressure points at the moment? I mean, I sometimes feel that those of us that sit in the kind of retail focused markets end up feeling like we're sort of talking at the rest of the supply chain, which isn't always terribly helpful. And I think certainly what we find sometimes is to explain, what's going on, what are the pressures that mean that questions are being asked further along the supply chain, i.e. guys like you. You're certainly seeing a lot of pressure at the moment around transparency on sustainability. You're seeing regulatory pressure. The Green Directive in the EU means that anything that gets stated around sustainability issues needs to be demonstrably true. Retailers need to communicate to customers, although customers, as I say, can be volatile. The fact still remains there needs to be a clear message passed on to consumers, and I'm sure Linda will say something about that in a minute. And the things I've got in brackets here are issues that we work on. So one of the projects that we work on is benchmarking of all the various wine sustainability standards around the world, of which Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is one. And the role there is to be able to provide that read across between the different standards globally. There's a huge amount of pressure at the moment around packaging. There's been a lot of talk for years about scopes 1, 2, and 3, but it's this year where the reporting requirements come in. So it's gone from being a sort of an issue down the line to being a current issue. You're seeing EPR having kicked in. That started in the UK this year. You're seeing it coming along in Europe fairly soon and in various US states. So that focus on packaging is because there's a lot more attention paid to it, and also bear in mind that EPR is a direct cost. We have a bottle weight accord, which some of you are members, and that looks to reduce the average bottle weight by 25% by 2026. And we've got the numbers for this year coming out later in the week. But were all of the savings to have happened in the UK, that would have saved retailers in our supply chain £32 million in costs avoided. So that's why that's a focus at the moment. There's a lot of focus at the moment on labour standards, and that's really driven, I think, by increasing regulatory requirements, but also because wine has found itself now in the crosshairs. A lot of other sectors down the years have seen themselves criticised on labour rights. I mean, most obviously the apparel sector, labour conditions in factories in places like Bangladesh. But you've now had some quite high-profile issues in France, in Bordeaux and Champagne, in Italy, in Langhe. So there's very much a realization that this is a live issue for wine. So there is that media and NGO pressure. So labour standards also very much in the frame at the moment. But I think also there's this issue of survivability. It was interesting. Some of you know I was speaking at the Australian Wine Institute Technical Conference back in July, and talking to quite a lot of the growers there. Conditions are changing so rapidly. This isn't just a question of sustainability in order to be able to say, yes, we meet relevant requirements, but it's a sense that climate change is a daily reality. It's something that people are facing into, not just something you read about in the press. And so how do growers adapt to climate change is really important. And we're in the process at the moment of working on our sustainable viticulture protocol, which is going to be a peer-to-peer sharing network. So those are some of the pressures at the moment. So why do it? Why bother? There's a vast amount of things that guys running wine businesses need to worry about. Why does this need to be on the table? And there's always going to be something that's, well, I've got to do this first. I think sometimes it's a question of how do we reframe some of the things that are seen as challenges. Obviously at the moment, part of the challenge that globally the wine industry has is there's more wine available than people are actually drinking. You're seeing drinker demand not declining massively, but you're seeing a sort of tail off in demand for wine. And so what you're seeing in some areas, for example in Bordeaux, is you're seeing a grubbing up of vineyards. But actually, does that necessarily need to be a challenge? Well, if you have I see I've managed to spell higher incorrectly, so apologies for my grammar. It was done late at night. But actually, you could argue that as particularly with the younger demographic, the general intel seems to be that they're drinking less and less frequently, but when they do, they drink better quality. So actually, is grubbing up necessarily a bad thing? Does that actually mean that there's an ability to produce less boggo wine and more quality wine? There's also the potential for innovation. I mean, I was speaking at the Nordic Monopolies Conference last summer, and they had a wine economist there, or a drinks economist, and he was making the point that other drinks, other beverage alcohol sectors have innovated in what they do. Look at gin. Gin just used to be London Dry, and they innovated with all the sort of flavored gins, and as a result, you had that massive gin boom. Wine hasn't done that. So again, is there an opportunity for wine to do things slightly differently? Yes, at the moment there's an uncertain trade environment, and whilst a certain individual is in the White House, that may not change. But doesn't that provide opportunities? I mean, Canada being the obvious one. Canada was until recently a massive buyer of US wine, and obviously that is not the case anymore. So does that actually provide untapped opportunities? I think Canada is an interesting market. You've got two big monopolies there who are concerned about the issues I was talking about just now. So deal with those issues. Canada is a potentially massive market for you guys in Australia. But then also this dealing with complexity, sustainability is a lot of different topics. It can seem daunting. And that's where organizations like ours, Sustainable Wine Roundtable, fit in. It's how do you collaborate with others? It's not, you don't have to do it on your own. We at SWR can, provide a perspective on what's going internationally. We provide mechanisms like our Sustainable Viticulture Protocol, like what we're doing on labour rights, like the Bottle Weight Accord, to provide a joined up approach. But also retailers are engaging too. We had a workshop a couple of months ago, and there's a realization that retailers can't just make demands of the rest of the supply chain. They need to support them. And Linda in a minute is going to talk about some of the stuff that Systembolaget and others are doing in that regard. So it's a question of reaching out, working with organizations like Wine Australia, organizations like us, Sustainable Wine Roundtable, and finding ways in which you can do these things together. So that's all from me. So I will hand back to Julian.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Peter. Some really interesting insights. I think for those on the call, there are a few acronyms in Peter's talk, but EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, really talking to the idea that those producing and using packaging will pay for that packaging, and that's certainly something that's been introduced in the UK, which is, as Peter said, there are opportunities with lightweight glass because simply put, if your bottles are lighter, you are spending less through the extended producer responsibility requirements. I should have mentioned this at the start of the webinar. We have a Q&A function at the top of the Teams menu here, and please feel free to input any questions into the Q&A function, and we'll have roughly about 20 minutes after everyone has presented to ask questions of each of the presenters, and it's a good opportunity to really, if you have something that you'd like to ask Peter or Linda or Mardi, for you to do so. So I'll introduce our next speaker now. Linda Johansson is the head of sustainability at Systembolaget in Sweden. And Linda, I'll pass to you so you can tell us a little bit more about who Systembolaget are and what you do in your role and some of your focus areas.
Did I get that right now, that you can see my first slide?
We can.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's always very exciting to get an opportunity to meet people, even if it's digitally. And I'm really looking forward to receive some questions later on. And that's why I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, so that we really allow time here for questions. But just a very sort of quick word on what is Systembolaget. We exist in Sweden, and we are a monopoly. We are the only retailer in Sweden that are allowed to sell alcoholic beverages directly to consumers. And we exist because the Swedish government, since many years, we actually celebrate 70 years this October. So we have existed for a very long time. And the reason why Sweden has chosen this way of selling alcoholic beverages is because we see that alcoholic beverages are different to other types of commodities that are sold, and we want to limit the negative impact of alcohol and also sell in a responsible way. So therefore, we as a state monopoly, we don't aim to maximize sales or profits. We do have a profit goal, but that's related into our cost and not into selling. And just a very brief note on why I chose this particular photo on this slide is because here it says, have you changed your mind on the sign there above the cardboard box? And at all the cash points, we have those types of boxes so that it's easy for consumers if they feel that maybe I took too many, it should be easy to actually return and you don't have to leave the line and give them back. And the same thing happens when you order online. The last question you get is that, do you really want to buy everything that you have now? Unlike other retailers who would ask you, if you buy this, you probably also want to have that. So that's just some small examples of how we are different. And then you would think that maybe, this is just imposed by the Swedish government on Swedish people, and Swedish people are very unhappy about it. But actually, we keep doing surveys all the time. And one of our most important KPIs is how happy consumers are with our way of selling alcohol and how we execute our 452 stores. And we rank extremely high. So from our last annual report, we had an index of 80.3 in the customer satisfaction index. And like I said, that's one of our most important KPIs. In addition to the 452 stores, we also have 461 agents. So this means that we reach all the entire Swedish population. We are not a very large population, 10 million plus, but it's a very big country and very densely populated. So we offer stores in all areas of the country. Also, what I think is interesting in this slide to look on the left-hand side here is that we have a set range which consists about 3,500 products, and that's about 94% of our sold volume. So here is really where the majority of the volumes lie. But we also want to offer a very wide range of products to our consumers. So we also have something called the order range, which is our suppliers' own range, where you can where we kind of act as a marketplace. So you directly there put products on the Swedish market. So this is very important to have sort of everything should be available to consumers. Then we also have a temporary and an exclusive range, again, quite a few products, sort of less share of volume, which makes sense. And we also have a local and small scale assortment, which is an open range to suppliers who qualify for those rules, so to speak. I just checked on our website, and as of today, we have 16,000 plus different types of wines. And out of those, it was 384 wines from Australia. But of course, this kind of change on a daily basis because of this order range, that it's possible for the Swedish suppliers and importers to kind of on a daily basis, more or less, add new products there. But that's just to give you sort of an idea of how many products we have available to Swedish consumers. Lots of information in this slide. I just want to sort of point you to two things here. One thing is on the left-hand side that we want to be the world's most caring specialist retailer. So we take this responsibility to really care for and sell your products in the best possible way. So we want to have an assortment for everyone. Sometimes we kind of jokingly say that we are both Gucci and Lidl in the same store. We have to cater to all types of consumers with the best service, and also do that in a responsible way. So we check age. We're not allowed to sell to someone who's under the influence and so on. On the right-hand side, we have our strategy and the focus areas now up to 2027. So our focus areas to increase our digital competence, to reduce the climate impact on our assortment, and also to be even stronger when it comes to public health. Then digging into more of the sustainability topics. We have, of course, looked at like all companies do, is our biggest impact areas. And that is, of course, human rights, environment and climate for cultivation and production, packaging and transport. Hopefully these areas make sense to you guys as well when you have looked at your biggest impacts. Because I should say that very often we kind of get the question that, you know, what is Systembolaget's priorities and what's important to us? And of course, we can answer that question, but I would more want to answer that question in a way to say that we want to ensure that we have products to sell. We want to ensure that we have a successful beverage industry. So we are not doing any of these things for us. It's not to sort of satisfy us in Sweden. All the focus areas that we have identified is to ensure that we have, you know, good soil, we have increased biodiversity, that we have good care of the people who are involved in this chain. So the most important thing for us is really for individual companies, for whole industries to take this responsibility. And I must admit, we very often look at what you guys do in Australia, both sort of individual companies, but also what you do as an industry together in terms of your sustainability strategies and reports and so on. And to us, that's really a role model way of doing, to take ownership. Because one of the worst things I know is when someone says, oh, we did this because Systembolaget said so, or we did this because, you know, someone else said. You really need to own your own sustainability work. And I think Peter said something similar earlier, that we as a retailer, we're very far from reality in one way, very close to consumers, but very far from, you know, cultivation, production of the beverages and so on. So we are only as good as the input we also get from the industry itself. So we always have an open door. We always want to collaborate, and we take our responsibility when it comes to what can we do in our role as retailer? How can we help you accelerate the good work that you already do? So with that little speech, just to make some comments here on the on this slide, and here I said something has also jumped. I have to blame the early morning here, but this is just to kind of say that we work very holistically. We have a very holistic approach when it comes to looking at sustainability, because we see, as the circle indicates here in the middle, that everything is integrated. Earlier, I think we worked a bit more separately on working conditions, looking at contracts, payments, and so on. But now we see the link to climate impact very big here, that people have to make different types of schedules and follow up and do health checks of their employees to ensure that they're not working during the most hot hours, for example. When it comes to climate, the connection with biodiversity is, of course, a very, very clear link. And all of this goes back to that it's actually about business risk and resilience. It's sometimes I don't really like the word sustainability. I think we should start talking about investment in the future, a way of future-proofing the business, because that's really why we are doing this. We want to have a successful business long term. To start talking about our sustainability work, and when I need to do this quite quickly, which I think I need to do now because I'm probably already taking more time than I anticipated, I want to start by just explaining the core of our sustainability work through explaining what we do in terms of guiding consumers to more sustainable products. We have 4 criteria that needs to be met for the products to get this additional customer guidance in our stores and online. And that starts with traceability. We need to then know where is the growing, where is the vineyard, and where is the production unit, and what does the chain look like, the supply chain look like for that product. We also look, of course, at environment and climate, and that needs to, today, how we can check that is to have a certification. We also look at working conditions, and then again for cultivation and production, which we see are the most sort of risky areas of the supply chain. And also today, when it comes to climate, we actually only look at the packaging type. But this is something that we will I'll speak to in a moment. Our benchmark study is probably also known to you. It's something that we have done since 2019, and that is because there's so many different certifications in wine, which is great. But we needed a tool to understand what do they cover, who stands behind it, so that we can actually give business benefits to those who have certifications. And that we do through that customer guidance that I just mentioned. So speaking very quickly here about what we do in the space of climate is that we started by looking at where, from Systembolaget's perspective, where is the main contributors to our climate impact. And I think this pie chart looks very similar to most retailers. It's in scope 3. What we do, even though we have 452 stores, is not the biggest impact. It comes from packaging, it comes from the raw materials, cultivation and production. And like I said, we have done a lot on packaging, which you probably are already aware of. We are part of the Bottled Way to Cord, of course, from Sustainable Wine Roundtable. We also already today have 60% of our volumes of wine in bag-in-box. But also looking at how can we have lighter glass bottles. But what we also know now is, of course, that how the packaging types are also produced is making a big impact. So we wanted to dig more deeper into not just packaging, but all the main contributors of the product's carbon footprint. So we have now tested in 3 different pilot projects, how we can measure better and in more detail on cultivation, production, packaging, and transport. And that leads us to what we call now as product carbon footprint. And I could have sort of my full presentation on this. I'm not going to say so much more about this work here now. There's a QR code and I can share the slides as well, so you can go in and read a bit more. But it actually it's about taking activity data, the actual data, so we can see the difference between someone who has invested in their vineyard, for example, compared to someone hasn't, because otherwise we will just look at Australia as one. You will have the same default data. So someone who has invested and done good things here will not actually be able to take account for that. And for us, of course, being a retailer, it makes sense to do it on a product level. Companies who are today measuring their carbon footprint on an organizational level will really benefit, because you will be really prepared. You will already have the data that you would then have to kind of cut and present more on a product level. And I think I've kind of run over time already, so I'm actually gonna skip this and just sort of briefly say that it might sound like a lot of work to report activity data, but we did see from these 3 pilot studies that we have done over the last year that companies actually also saw a lot of benefits with, of course, increased awareness, but also we saw some quite interesting links between what companies had done in biodiversity that they now could kind of put figures on and get sort of credit for by then calculating their product carbon footprint. The supply chain traceability, which Peter also spoke about, is of course important, and by actually reporting data from the different activities of a product also helped to get that kind of traceability. So I think I should stop there. Well, one final thing. We have a document, which I wasn't sure if that was aware of you, which we call as the Framework for Sustainable Procurement. And I think that kind of is a good document if you're interested to understand more of our priorities in how we buy and what we look at. So I've added a link there, and perhaps that could be shared as well directly with the participant. It gives a good kind of summary on how we think around sustainability in our purchasing process at Systembolaget. I'll end there.
Thanks for that, Linda. There's a lot of information there for people to digest, and we will share those slides after the webinar. Just picking up on some of your points, and I think the discussion around activity data another word for that is, and this is a good link to what Mardi will speak about, is information that is captured through being a Sustainable Wine Growing Australia member. So activity data can be things like your fuel use, your electricity use, fertilizer application. So things that are certainly captured through Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. Thank you, Linda. And on that note, I'll pass to Mardi Longbottom, who's the General Manager of Sustainability and Engagement at Australian Wine Research Institute. Thanks, Mardi.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks, Linda, and thanks, Peter, for coming before me. I am aware that most people here on the call today understand what Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is, but I just wanted a quick reminder, it is the national program for sustainability here in Australia, open to grape growers and winemakers across Australia. And I just wanted to, I guess, as a preamble going into, I really wanted to focus today just around the partnerships that we operate with and feedback loops within the program that inform the content that goes into the program. So I guess having said that, they're the latest stats there, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think partnerships are critical for our sustainable future, and Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is underpinned by the strong partnership between the three national bodies working towards a common industry goal. Across our organisations, we're leveraging our respective in-house expertise. We're looking at different capacities in our organisations and projects to make sure that we're delivering a world-class program and utilising our collective reach into industry to make sure we're evolving to meet emerging needs. So having said that, and I showed this slide before, it was really just to, really clearly demonstrate that we're now operating with more than 1,800 members across Australia, and our members are located in 61 out of the 65 regions. Now, there are only a couple of regions that don't have members in them. They're smaller regions, and they're regions that are close by to other regions. So we're in quite close proximity to most Australian producers, and that 69% of them have been through that independent certification process. And the coverage is around getting close to 70% of the vineyard area in Australia and around about 90% of crush last year going through member wineries. So what this does for us, it gives us a really good base of information that we can draw from. So when I think about our program and how it's evolved over the many, many, many years that we've been running it, it's really a lot of the input we have into the program comes directly from members. We take around about 3,000 calls from members throughout the year. So this is probably our strongest and most powerful source of information and feedback that goes into the program. We take that information and then we actually run it through a number of our different groups that we have at our, they're often there to help us out. We have a really strong regional network, and we have a group that meets every quarter roughly. And these are people sitting in lots of different regions who are actively engaged with the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia program and working with members in their regions. So they give us a lot of feedback on the ground too. But often when we're hearing things through the help desk, we can run some of these ideas past these groups. So there's not just that regional network, but we have quite a number of other groups, interest groups and regional groups that we will pass this information through, do a lot of ground truthing work with them. And it's also a way that they can feed us back information too. So this might be a big wine producer. They're in these networks and they're telling us, we've just put a tender in to Systembolaget, for example, and they've asked for these requirements. So just be on the lookout. These are the things we're being asked for. Won't just be Systembolaget. It'll be many other places that they're selling wine into. And they're giving us intel all the time about what the requirements are and what the things are coming down the pipeline. One of the other, really powerful groups that we talk to are the groups that are operating internationally. So this includes a lot of the retailers we're reaching out to from time to time, or people that we know working on behalf of the wine industry who are located in the international markets. The other really important one is Freshcare. They're a really very important partner of ours because they provide our certification standards, but they're operating in the space of standards, and they are familiar with many different standards that are out there. So we get a lot of intelligence back from them as well, and we feed back in through their technical subcommittee. So I just wanted to show you there, we do have a number of continuous improvement feedback loops going on with the program a lot of the time. For those of you not quite so familiar with the program, the way we also operate is that there's two quite distinct components of the program itself that all members go through this annual reporting process of business metrics. So that tends to be the quantitative data around the things Julian was mentioning before, the fuel use, water use, electricity use, those, the things that we can measure. And then the other part is the self-assessment. So this is much more qualitative information, and it's a self-reporting around the processes that members do. Now, the important parts about those two areas of the program is really this is around awareness raising for members. They can become a lot more familiar with their own data. They can also track their data within the program itself, and they can access a whole lot of resources that are provided through the program. So this is much more around awareness raising, and it's not until it comes to the third part, which is the voluntary going down the certification pathway. And it's through the certification process that a lot of the practices start to get embedded. So those of you who've been through the process understand that this is about tracking the different processes and practices that you're doing in your vineyard or winery. So it's making use of the data, but also really around demonstrating to a third party that you are doing what you say you're doing. And then next is embedding those processes into a cycle of continuous improvement. It's been a high priority of ours over many, many years to make sure that our program evolves and make sure that it's aligned with international programs as well. Linda mentioned this just earlier. Since I'm not sure when this first started, but Sustainable Wine Growing Australia has been part of an international benchmarking study that Intertech's done. But this was really Systembolaget who started this benchmarking study quite a few years ago. And this enables us to line up against many international programs across a lot of different criteria as well, so that we can see how we're tracking across the different criteria that's expected internationally of a sustainability program. In 2022, the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework was launched. So this is one that's funded and also supported by the Australian government here, and it's a broad agricultural framework that in theory, any sector can line itself up against. So when they first started putting this program together back in 2022, we were the first one of, I think, the first 4 or 5 programs that were benchmarked against this one. So this was also a really important part of our evolution. Linda mentioned this before. I think it was in around 2023 that Systembolaget introduced their most sustainable beverages category. And it was really important for us to make sure that those of our members who've been through certification qualified to have the little tag that says that they are one of the most sustainable beverages being sold in Systembolaget stores. And then last year, for the first time, the Sustainable Wine Roundtable did their pilot series, I think, of maybe around 5 different international sustainability programs, and Sustainable Wine Growing Australia was one of those who participated in their benchmarking exercise. So putting all of those things together has given us incredible insights into the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia program. One of the things that has come out of all of these different exercises over the years, and we've always known this, is that the social element of sustainability has been one of the weaknesses. And I guess there's a reason for this. We've always relied heavily on our legislative framework here in Australia, and we still do. It's just that there's been becoming, I guess, more pressure from the international marketplace for us to demonstrate through a third-party audit that we're not just following the law, but we can actually demonstrate it and have it verified. So this came up throughout all of these different benchmarking exercises. So we knew that this was an emerging issue. So last year we took elements and the results from those exercises. We also looked at a couple of other standards, Fair for Life, Fair Farms, and the Social Accountability International Standard there. And we have come up with the most important parts, and we did some work in the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia workbook to update the social section. So those of you who are a bit familiar with the program will know that some of these things have been there for several years, but they've just been updated this year. And to show you what it looks like, we've actually included separately these things here that you can see: modern slavery, freedom of association, youth employment, safe working conditions, equal opportunities with no discrimination and harassment, conditions of employment for employees, and also remuneration. The reason I show you this is just to, I guess, demonstrate. So around modern slavery, all this is simply it's a self-declaration that you're not engaging in modern slavery. But importantly, these are live links, and you can click on those and get more information about what actually modern slavery is. But also, if you click on the tooltips here, there's quite a bit of information about modern slavery, and there's also those links in there as well. So it's a really good place to go to get more information. And just on freedom of association, same thing. It's not a term that we often use here. I think these two elements are not particularly big risks for us in our industry, but they are emerging issues that we need to be aware of. So same with this one. If you can click on the tooltip there, you'll see that there's extra information and links to other resources that you can use. So just to come back to this slide, I just wanted to show that, again, we've introduced these things because we're recognising that the international landscape is moving, and that we needed to address these within the program. So we've introduced them into not necessarily the business metrics, but into the self-assessment part of the program. The next step really is to move them into the certification standards. So as I said before, our certification standards are owned and managed by Freshcare. And Freshcare is currently in the process of reviewing the standards. They're doing a wholesale review. But one of the elements that they are looking at is the social section, and coming up with a recommendation for how we might integrate these things into our certification standards. Doing that, and I guess part of the process always, is weighing up the balance of how much benefit people will gain from going through an independent audit of these issues, and also like what it might cost, because everything new that we introduce into the program has a cost to those being audited. So we have to make sure we find the balance there. So that is pretty much all I wanted to cover off right at the minute, but I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thanks for that, Mardi. That was a really good overview, and I think really compelling as to why we focus on responsible labour practices and the changing, I guess, landscape of sustainability. It's always moving. We don't have any questions in the Q&A, but I have some questions for each of you. I'll start with you, Linda. You mentioned earlier about, you put up a slide showing the carbon footprint of each of the packaging types that are stocked at Systembolaget. Could you provide some information on why bag in a box or Tetra Pak are preferred to glass bottles?
That slide shows like you said, the carbon footprint of the packaging types, and the sources of that is LCA studies that we've done together with the Nordic monopolies. So that's again global averages, and this was some of the things that if I had more time, I could speak to more in detail. So thank you for the question. So, but what we have learned now, and I think that's also something that Peter will speak to, knowing that some of the glass manufacturers are actually members of the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, they are also working very actively on reducing their carbon footprint. And that was what the circle around the lightweight bottle, and kind of the sort of the different lines there showing that also goes down, because when we speak to individual, for example, glass manufacturers, they can show and demonstrate that they have, a much more energy efficient process. They have changed the sources of energy, for example. They have a higher content of recycled materials into the final glass bottle, which actually then will have a lower carbon footprint. And that's what we want to achieve by our product carbon footprint module, where packaging is one part of that. That if companies, if glass or other packaging manufacturers can demonstrate that they actually have their actual production process has a lower carbon footprint than the global average that we have from that LCA study, we can then sort of take account for that, and that product then will show as having a lower carbon footprint. But if we talk about consumers, that why do we prefer, for example, PET bottles and bag-in-box? So, like I said, 60% of the wine sold in Sweden is already on bag-in-box. So that is by far the most preferred packaging type for Swedish consumers. And what we did at Systembolaget to achieve that was nothing. We were against it, because from a public health perspective that we saw high risks of having that packaging type, to be honest. So this is 100% consumer driven in Sweden. Still in our stores, we underexpose bag-in-box, because if we were a commercial company, 60% of the square meters in the store would then display only bag-in-box, but we don't. We still sort of under display it, but it still sells so well. So now we work very actively with that category. So we have, wines of all different types of price points. It's not just sort of the cheaper wines, for example. And same thing with PET, with paper-based, like Tetra packs, with cans. It's very much because Swedish consumers are very practical. If you have a boat, if you have your summer house, you don't want to carry heavy glass bottles. I think some consumers have started to realize that the packaging is just packaging, and it's the content, it's the liquid inside that they want to focus on, and then they choose the packaging type which is convenient. From older consumers, they want us to display PET bottles in stores, because they want to very easily to identify those, because it's easier for them to carry home and to dispose of. And we have a disposal system, so you get, you pay a deposit and then you get money back when you return or PETs and cans.
It's fascinating, because I think that consumers have very different ideas about packaging depending on markets, and I know that Swedish consumers in particular are very flexible in terms of packaging types, and it's probably an education campaign that we all need to partake in terms of having people accept alternative packaging, because, as you said, we're really focused on the liquid in the bottle.
Yeah.
Peter, I would love for you to explain a little bit more around extended producer responsibility and what we've seen in the UK and how that really impacts anyone sending wine to the UK.
Well, first of all, thanks for filling in my use of TLAs, three-letter acronyms. EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, was introduced in the UK starting this year, and basically it places a responsibility on effectively the retailer to pay for any packaging that goes into the supply chain to be recycled, reused, done away with at end of life. And theoretically, therefore, retailers need to put in place their infrastructure for doing it, but in practice, how it manifests is a charge, a levy on the weight of packaging that goes into the supply chain. So, and there's different pricings for different products. So in the case of glass, I've actually got the number wrong. It was originally going to be £240, pounds sterling per ton. It actually came out at £194 per ton. But the fact remains that still becomes a significant cost for businesses. I mean, I obviously can't use specific retailers' names on something like this, but one of the smaller UK retailers that we deal with, EPR is costing them about £500,000 a year, and that's money straight off their bottom line. Given their bottom line is only 2 or 3 million in the first place, it's a very, very significant issue. And therefore what that means is that they want to avoid those charges, because they can't necessarily pass on that additional cost to the consumer, because consumers don't understand it. It's, as you will all know, quite a price sensitive market. So that means that they will tend to default to suppliers who are playing ball when it comes to packaging. Actually, I was with this retailer visiting Prosecco in northern Italy last year. And we were saying to the growers there, you say we must have an 800-gram Prosecco bottle. Well, hang on, if I can buy Oz-Secco from Australia in cans at a much lower weight, therefore lower APR, I'm going to do that. I'll buy that, not Prosecco. So it really is significantly guiding retailers' behavior. And it's live in the UK, but similar regulations are coming into place in Europe shortly, and you're also seeing the same thing coming in certain US states. So this is something you guys are going to hear more and more about. And again, it's one of those things that the more you're playing more on these things, the more that you're at least understanding where that pressure is coming from. Because I appreciate that sometimes the people on the ground know about it is when they get an email saying, we don't like your bottles, make them lighter. But this is why you're getting those emails. I think also to pick up on the point you were discussing with Linda just now, I think we're doing some work next year looking at kind of balancing the different pros and cons from a sustainability perspective of different packaging formats. Because obviously, you know, something like bag-in-box works brilliantly in Sweden where they can do the recycling of them. But say in the UK, they work less well because it's a mixed material. It can't be recycled at the moment. I think the other point to pick up on what you were just saying at the end of your comments, Julian, is I think it's consumers get used to alternative formats over time, or different formats over time. You think when the screw cap was introduced, everyone thought that was, that was sacrilege. That was, worse than swearing at God. But now it's accepted as being normal. Ditto what you're seeing in some European markets at the moment is an increased acceptance of single serve cans. Particularly for younger consumers, where a 750ml bottle might be more than they want to spend, or they only want one drink in the middle of the week. Actually, can make sense. If you're at Glastonbury Festival, you can't take glass in. A can makes sense. I think it's getting people used to innovation. I mentioned it in relation to how wine works, but consumers being used to it. So anyway, that's why EPR, extended producer responsibility, is a big issue and will continue to be so.
Thank you, Peter. Well said, by the way. That was a great explanation. Mardi, you spoke a little bit about responsible labour practices, and you covered this a little bit about some of the drivers for this, but I guess what are we seeing in terms of the global landscape, and why are we focused on responsible labour now, and why has it become an issue in the last, 12 months, 18 months in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd love to. I'll give you my response, and then perhaps ask Peter what he sees. He's probably got a broader view of the international landscape. I think here in Australia, though, like I said, we, take it for granted that we have these laws in place to protect us, protect our workers. And I still do think we do a pretty good job of this. However, there are isolated cases, not so much that have hit the media from the wine industry, but certainly in other agricultural sectors where there has been, misuse, abuse of workers. And I think we want to avoid that at all costs. So, again, I think we do a pretty good job. This is just an extra check. And if we can do that, and at this stage, what we're really doing through the program is raising awareness to these issues. We're not asking people to be independently audited, around those things right now, but it's really raising that awareness so that if down the track, the pressure from our customers internationally is such that we need to have those independently verified, we'll be ready, and our people, our growers, our winemakers know what we're talking about and know what people we're looking for, and that we can actually do that later on. But yeah, I'd be keen to hear perhaps from Peter on that as well.
No, I think the point that Mardi makes is a fair one, and it's the point that Mardi makes is one that we've had from growers in other countries as well. In the States, in various other European countries where we've covered the labour rights issues. And I think this isn't us in Europe somehow standing in judgment, but the fact remains that laws being in place isn't necessarily a strong enough issue. And a good example, we have laws in this country, in the UK, around modern slavery, and we have very robust structures in place. But yet there was a media expose earlier this year that found slave labour, forced labour in a McDonald's restaurant just east of London. So the fact that you have laws in place does not mean that these issues do not happen. Ditto in France. France has very strong regulations around this, but people died in Champagne 2 years ago through heat exposure. There was a terrible expose in Bordeaux about highly substandard accommodation for migrant workers. In Italy, they discovered they had forced labour from North Africa. So the fact that laws are in place does not stop these issues happening. And certainly from our perspective, as what we look for when we're doing our benchmarking of standards, is that there is a proactive requirement within a standard these issues be looked at, and that they are covered in what one looks at. Because it provides, as Mardi said, it provides that insurance process. It provides that, way of knowing, these things are being looked at. Because the challenge, of course, is that people who are engaging in modern slavery practices are not not terribly nice people, but they also know what they're doing is wrong, and they will constantly seek to hide it. And so it's only by proactively looking that you're going to have some sense of what might be there. But again, I think the important thing to say there is this needs to be seen as a collective problem. This is not something to say to an individual grower, you're suddenly bad and horrible because you've got this going on in your wine farm. It's a question of saying, this is a systemic issue. How can you work with us? How can you work with, you know, Mardi at Sustainable Wine Growing? How can you work with Julian at Wine Australia to say how to do that? Also, with all these things, it's how can you raise it? How can we at an international level start to understand how these things manifest? You know, our work on labour rights is around how can we provide case studies of how others have done it? How can we share knowledge between growers about, you know, what do I need to actually look for? What should be the things that the sniff test? What is it that makes me think I should perhaps look at this more in detail? But it is working with others. It's not just feeling I've got to do this on my own. It's, you know, looking at people like, you know, retailers like Linda, international organizations like ours, you know, national bodies like Wine Australia, Sustainable Wine Growing, Australian Wine Institute, work with us. And that's the way we can sort these issues out properly. But it needs to be something that the industry proactively does rather than just say, we've got laws for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Mardi, and thanks, Linda. I think that brings us to time. On the issue of modern slavery, our next webinar on the 10th of December will focus on this issue. A project's been undertaken over the past kind of 4 or 5 months looking at resources that can be pulled together and information packs and guides to help, first of all, recognise and identify good responsible labour practices, but also risks that we might see through contract labour and through our supply chains. And those resources will be available in the new year. And so our next webinar will focus on these resources. All of the recording and the slides, if the presenters are happy to do so, if you could forward the slides to Kim and I, and we will share those with all attendees. And the recording will be available for anyone that wants to have a look at this at a later date. So please feel free to recommend to anyone that you think would have some value in watching this. But thank you for joining us very early, Peter. Thank you, Linda, for being so flexible, and for I love the Peppa Pig background. I prefer to see a Bluey. My kids are more of a Bluey fan, but thank you for joining us, and thanks, Mardi, for joining us late as well.